Welcome, everyone, to day 3 of the YSI Early Career Days. My name is Heske from Doornen. I'm one of the managers at INET's Young Scholars Initiative, and I'll be your moderator today. We are here for a session called A Conversation on Writing in Economics, with 4 fantastic panelists, 3 of which are here with me on the call, and one of whom has submitted a set of written remarks that we will share with you. So let me introduce them to you. We have Carola Binder, who is Associate Professor of Economics at Haverford College, as well as Associate Editor of the Review of Economics and Statistics and the Journal of Money, Credit and Banking. We also have Claire Jones, who is the Global Economy Reporter at FT Alphaville. And since January this year, she's also the editor of Trade Secrets. She writes about topics at the intersection of economics, politics, and markets. And then, of course, we have Lynn Parramore, Senior Research Analyst at INET. Lynn is a cultural theorist studying the intersection of culture and economics, and she frequently contributes to Reuters, Al Jazeera, Salon, Huffington Post, and Alternet, where she's a contributing editor. And the person who was unable to be here live is Paul Dudenhefer, who's managing editor of Politics and Society and a staff member at Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke. Paul has also spent many years teaching writing to economics students and has produced lots of helpful guides on that topic. So we're super glad he was still able to contribute his input, and I will relay that to you after we hear from everyone else. So each of our panelists will speak for roughly 10 minutes. And you're very welcome to use the Q&A button to submit your questions at any time. Throughout the discussion, you can be submitting those, and I will be sure to bring them to our panelists towards the end. So with that, Carola, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks so much. It's really fun to be here. I do have a couple of slides, so I will work on sharing those. So give me just a second. Okay, so you should be able to see them, right? Okay, I'll just get going then. So I'm going to be talking about writing in economics, of course. And what I wanted to start with is, first things first, which is use your own words. Plagiarism is not just a student issue. Plagiarism is something that scholars unfortunately do pretty often as well. I've noticed it as a referee and as a reader. You need to use your own words. You probably know that you shouldn't plagiarize on purpose. You also shouldn't plagiarize on accident either. And what do I mean by that? I mean, you need to take an active role in making sure you understand what plagiarism is and making sure that you don't, take notes by pasting things into a Word document and then forget that you've pasted them and accidentally plagiarize them. You need to kind of actively make sure that you're not plagiarizing. If you don't understand whether or not something constitutes plagiarism, you need to take the responsibility to find that out. Paul, you need to stop that. Okay, so that's like the serious note I wanted to start on, but there's a lot more about writing that's more fun to talk about. So precision is key. All my children, or most of my children, want to introduce themselves. Precision is key in writing, and that means that you need to be clear about what it is that you are trying to say. When you're writing about economics, there's a couple of ways that you can be more precise. One is by using active voice instead of passive voice. When you use active voice, then you know who the subject or what the subject of your sentence is. And that kind of disciplines you to make sure that you're being clear about what you actually mean. The phrases that I always highlight in my students' writing and ask them to remove is any sort of version of the phrase "look at," or the authors look at, or I'm going to look at, or I'm going to see how. You need to use I'm sorry about that. You need to use other verbs that have a more defined and precise meaning. So instead of we look at the relationship between X and Y, we can test whether X increases Y. We can see whether X has a causal effect on Y. We don't see how two variables interact. We need to use more precise language than anything about look or see that is taken as a metaphor you don't want to use in your writing. Another thing to mention about writing is the use of quotes. So it's sort of hard to know how to quote effectively. Using quotations can make your writing more effective. They can have a great, they can add great style and emphasis to your writing, but you need to use them quotes sparingly. You should quote for emphasis and not out of laziness. And by that, I mean, maybe it is effective to use a quote from a speech by a central banker to make a point that you're trying to make for the motivation of your paper. Or maybe it's great to to quote a news headline, or if you're working on an economic history project, great to get a quote from somebody who is living through the era that you're writing about. But you should quote for emphasis, not because you don't feel like putting something into your own words. Okay, so that usually means using just one or two quotes and using them from a famous person or a newspaper or something like that. And you can, when you're giving a quote, don't make it longer than necessary. Use the shortest possible version of it. You can use ellipses, a ... to make it shorter. Okay, next point. When you're writing, I mentioned precision. Another thing that's important is concision, being concise, not writing more words than you need to. It can be painful to cut writing that you've spent a lot of time on, because often you might need to cut words or sentences or even whole paragraphs or even whole sections. So you guys need to be quiet or get out of here. If it feels too painful to delete something that you've spent a lot of time writing, you can sort of play a mental trick with yourself, which is just paste it, cut and paste it into a different document that you can call old stuff or something like that, so that you can come back and get it later if you want to add it back in. But I can almost guarantee you won't need to do that. No, you need to be quiet. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes we have, I wanted to do a little bit of an example. This is from a student essay that was from a while back, and I wanted to just show you the sentence that was in there and then think about how we could change it. So it says, the current analysis contributes to the previously stated areas of literature by investigating how the culmination of immigrants' experiences of discrimination, language barriers, poor economic outcomes, and access to public assistance plays a role in the potential correlation between immigrants' difficulty in the dominant language and an onerous application process for accessing social assistance programs. Okay, so that was one sentence, but it was very long. It was pretty wordy, and by the end of it, you've sort of forgotten the beginning, and it's kind of hard to tell what is even going on there. So let's go through a couple of different things that parts that we might want to cut or change. So first, the current analysis contributes to. Well, what the writer means is that the writer, this analysis or that person, if I were the writer, I would say I contribute to, instead of saying the previously stated areas of literature. You can just remove previously stated areas of. That's some passive voice, and it's just not even necessary. And then some of these things like the culmination of, I think those are just sort of extra words that aren't really needed at all. You also want to check your grammar. Okay, access to public assistance plays is what they wrote, and maybe that's because assistance plays sounds right, but this is actually like a list of different things, so it's plural, so we want to say play a role. And then more wordiness that you can cut out. So let's see how you might rewrite this sentence. You could say, my analysis contributes to the literature by investigating how language barriers may limit immigrants' access to social assistance programs. That's a lot easier to follow. You could even make it more you could even make it shorter. You could say, I investigate how language barriers limit immigrants' access to social assistance programs. See, we've got it down from like 5 lines to 1 line. We have active voice. We have a subject, I, investigate, and then sort of one clause about what that person investigates. Okay. One more example, we're not going to edit this whole paragraph, and I'm not going to read the whole paragraph out loud, but this is also from some student writing. Men and women also saw dissimilar unemployment statistics when businesses were shut down. Remember, I told you don't use see or saw or variants of those metaphorically. So I don't like this also saw. Most recessions in the past, most notably the Great Recession, show the unemployment rate for men to be higher than the rate for women. Show is also a don't use it metaphorically kind of word. Then there's some language that's a little bit too casual for academic writing, where the COVID-19 pandemic flips the script. That's a little bit too casual of a phrase. And then there's a lot of passive voice. Like these numbers can be attributed partly to, there's a quote here that it doesn't have any lead in. It's just the quote is given. And it's a sort of quoting out of laziness example where it's not making a real point. They're not really, they're not using the quote for emphasis. They're just using it because they'd rather not put these statistics into their own words. So, okay, a little bit of how you might start to clean this up. Though again, we won't have time to get through all of it, but let's see. I thought, well, we can probably just remove this first sentence. Yeah, the highlighted parts are all things that I think we needed to change. Like this last sentence here, Congress must act to put women on a positive path once again. That's just really vague language. Like Congress must act. If you're an economist, you need to think about incentives and how must Congress act. You don't just say what people or institutions must do. And a positive path, once again, is also a little bit vague. Okay, so here's the original quote at the top. One way that you could basically say everything that they've said a lot shorter. In the Great Recession, men were unemployed at a higher rate than women. In the pandemic, the opposite occurred. So a little bit of parallel structure here. In the Great Recession, in the pandemic, and then the main statistic, I've put it here pretty succinctly. I've removed the unnecessary quotes and just in general removed a lot of unnecessary language and put everything into active voice. So a lot of times what you first write, you will realize that you could say the same thing a lot shorter and without really losing much of the information that you've provided. So that's always what you should be aiming to do. Okay. So that was the end of my slides. And I think that was also about the end of my time that I had. So I will pass it over to the next speaker.
Thank you so much, Carola. I think it's really wonderful actually to bring it down to this sentence level, because this is the kind of training that is so rare for us as aspiring economists. And it helps so much when you start clarifying your words. You are actually forced to clarify your ideas, I find, a lot of the time. So terrific. And thank you so much. We're going to move on to Claire Jones and hear her perspective from maybe a more journalistic angle here.
Sure. So thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for inviting me here today. And hello to you all watching wherever you are in the world. I work for the Financial Times. I've been there for 10, 11 years. I've been working in financial journalism since 2005. So what I want to give you an idea of today is how to write for sort of like finance or business audience. What I've done is I'm going to present to you 5 rules which our opinion editors do use with people and you know they say to follow, which I think is a good place to start. What I'd say is these rules are very, very useful, but they're not set in stone. So please, writing is about developing your own style, doing what suits you, drawing on your own experience, most of all. But there is a certain craft element of it, so I think it's good to to keep some ideas from the professionals in mind. So this advice that I'm going to present now is about writing opinion. The Financial Times has an opinion page where we run about 4 articles per day. We have outside contributions, which tend to come from business figures or economists or politicians. And these are the steps that we advise them to use, really. If you want to know more about how, to write more kind of like analytical or new style pieces, then, please ask away and I'll try to come to those questions in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to focus on opinion. So 5 rules. Here we go. So the first one is think about who you are writing for. So say in the case of the FT, we have a very global audience. So what you have to bear in mind is, if you're writing about, say, even someone as big in the financial world as Jay Powell, you really need to explain to, say, a Malaysian exporter why what Jay Powell says matters to them. So you really have to you have to remember that, we don't want articles that read like inside baseball. They have to take into mind we've got a global audience. Of course, if you're writing for a trade publication, then the audience that you're writing for is going to be narrower. So you have to care about that less. Or you could be writing about a specific, for a specific geographical audience. But, I think the rule is to just maybe sit back, take 5 to 10 minutes before you start writing and think, who is the audience for this paper? Which sort of people do I think read the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Economist, or any other publication? So you want to kind of think of like, who are the readers? So I think this is a good rule to start with. The second rule is write about what you know. And clearly we want people with expertise. We don't want people just, mouthing off on areas that they know nothing about. But it's not just about expertise. It's about your experience and perspective and insight as well. What we really like is articles that are going to, challenge conventional wisdom. And often the best way to do that is to say, what have I experienced that's made me think that the way we think about things or the way people tend to think about this problem isn't quite right. And some of the pieces that work really well is when you do get someone saying, I've worked in this company and we always thought we had to do it like X, but actually we tried out Y and that works so much better. So those sorts of insights about things that you've experienced personally, don't shy away from writing them into your copy because they really make it a nice read in a lot of instances. The third rule is write clearly and accessibly. I think Carola presented some really, really nice examples of how to do that. You want to use active voice, not passive voice. You want to use shorter words. And we have something which we call the 95% rule, where we say, unless you think this term is going to be understood by 95% of people reading the article, then explain it. So clearly 95% is a lot. So you really want to cover all bases. Don't just assume that people know this term that might be kind of like, a part of the lexicon in the area that you work with. It may not be so commonly understood to, someone who's reading the FT in another country or coming from it from a kind of like another kind of like industry. So, really kind of like look to that 95% rule and really err on the side of caution because, you're going to be edited by us as well. So, we can take it out if we do think more than 95% of the readers understand it. So best to err on the side of caution there. The fourth one, it echoes what I said in the second point a little bit too. Use specific examples in your writing. It just makes it so much nicer to read. I think how I once spoke to someone at the BBC who was an economics producer at the BBC, and he made the point that the best economic stories, they often kind of like, you kind of think about them as the smallest window, which gives you the biggest view. And what do I mean by that? You kind of want to kind of like take that nugget of information, to say like, the price of paper clips in Vietnam, or look at, say, something like, I don't know, there's so many examples, or that kind of like real statistic that maybe sticks out in people's heads that, really illustrates the point that you're wanting to make really, really nicely. The other thing that I've found works very well when I've been commissioning pieces for Alphaville is people using historical analogies. Of course, the past doesn't always repeat itself, but it does rhyme, as Mark Twain said. And I think, especially in the kind of economic sphere, people do have a real interest, or readers do have a real interest in economic history. So if you can find any parallels in history that don't feel too forced, then I'd really recommend using them. And so the fifth point is be sharp and stick to word counts. Now, I think, again, Carola gave us some very, very good examples about how to have sharpness in our writing. I mean, really, my best tip on this is to kind of like write your draft, then go away, maybe have lunch, maybe have a cup of tea, and then come back and kind of see what you can cut out of it. And more often than not, there's quite a bit that you can crop. So always give things a second and a third read. And you'll usually find yourself able to be sharper and sharper on each reread. The word counts are super important for us. If we ask for a piece that's 800 words long, we don't mind if it's 790 or 810, but if you send in something that's 900 or 1,000 words, it's going to be problematic. Of course, as Carola says, often, people have spent a lot of time writing things. We know that, but at the same time, we have to fit certain slots in the paper, and it's more than just that. It's almost like you just do need brevity as well, in order to make writing strong in an awful lot of instances, especially when we're talking about newspaper journalism. We're not talking about works of fiction here or poetry. People who are reading it are often, quite time poor. So the briefer you can be, the better. I think that, having said that, I think that is less of a constraint in economics writing now than it was. And I do think you see a lot of good analytical economics writing that's longer than that. I think Substack is something that really seems to be taking off, especially in the US. And a lot of really good economics writers will be writing for Substack, and those, they're a lot longer than the newspaper articles would be, a lot of their posts or a lot of their newsletters. But I think they do a decent job of going into more depth in a lot of areas. So I think these would be kind of like the 5 pieces of advice that our opinion editors like to give out. I'm going to add a 6th of my own, and that is, don't try to do too much with one piece. The temptation, especially when you're expert in something and really know your stuff, is to tell us all about what you know. But for the sake of an opinion piece, that just doesn't really work. I mean, what you really want is a very strong idea to come through, and don't try to make more than kind of like 2 or 3 points within the space of a piece. A good way to see if you're going to run into difficulty there is do 2 things before you start to write. I think the first thing to do is just try to summarize your argument in 2 to 3 paragraphs. I think that's a really, really important thing to do, because it just stops you veering off track when you're writing it. The other thing that works for some completely magical reason that I don't quite know why is try to write it in kind of like in longhand with your pen. For some reason, when you just write something, it doesn't have to be exact, but your kind of first draft by pen, somehow you get to the point when you're right. It does something to your mind where the point reveals itself. And then when you do later drafts subsequently, it can work very well. So I think I'm going to stop there for now. But as I said at the start, I'd welcome any questions, and thanks a lot for taking the time to listen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Claire. I think I, for one, will be writing down this list and taping it to the front of my desk for the next time I try to write anything at all, because this is a great way to summarize some really high-level techniques that I think will go a long way. Thank you so much. I'm excited to hear from Lynn next. So Lynn, please take the floor.
Yes, thank you so much. And those were such great pointers that we heard already. So I'll piggyback on a couple of things you've heard and give you a little list of my own. I have taught essay writing at New York University, and I've been writing for popular audiences for a long time, often about economic matters. And so I'm going to speak more to writing to general audiences who may not have an economic or business background. But a lot of these ideas will apply to any kind of writing that you will do. I have a little list of that's 3 things that I think should go into a piece of writing for a general audience. And one is an idea, some kind of story or narrative, and a way of making a connection to your audience. What do I mean by idea? It seems like a really obvious thing to have an idea when you sit down to write something. But I bet you've read a lot of things and heard a lot of presentations where you probably couldn't tell me what the idea was that the author was trying to express. And this is sort of refining even further than creating a summary, which I think is also a really great idea, what Claire was just mentioning. But this is something that really can be communicated in one sentence. And it helps to focus your attention so that you don't dump too many different thoughts into one relatively short piece of writing. So what is an idea? What does it look like? It's something that has tension in it. It might be a question that you're asking. It might be a challenge that you're putting forth, but it's something that you have to say that's not sort of obvious and out there in the world. It's something that you can communicate, something of value you're communicating to your audience. And I work with a lot of scholars who tell me, no, I can't communicate what I have to say in one sentence. And so I'll show them Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, and I'll give them the idea. It's the concentration, capitalism leads to the concentration of wealth. Boom, done, one sentence. You can do that. You're not communicating everything that's in the volume, but you're getting your idea out there in one sentence. And this is often, when you're writing for the web, something that can get placed at the very top of your article or your essay or even your opinion piece. A lot of people think that they are supposed to take a piece of writing and build up to sort of get to their point at the very end. But you'll often find editors moving what you've said at the end up to the top of the piece. And one rule of thumb that you can think about when you're writing for a popular audience, or any audience really, is you need to tell them what you're going to tell them the thing you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them. So you are reinforcing your idea a couple of times throughout the piece that you're writing, because people attention spans wander. Economics is often difficult material, so you really want to make sure that you've got your idea right up at the top and that it's present throughout your piece, and your conclusion carries that idea as well as the middle. Your beginning, middle, and end all carry that idea. So the other thing that I think that you need is some kind of story or narrative. And a lot of people think, well, what does story have to do with economists? And I think it actually has a lot to do with economists. And economists are storytellers just like anybody else. The way you look at data and the way you present it, you've already created a story about that data when you sit down to write. So a story can communicate the consequences of your idea, why it matters to people, what would happen if your idea isn't taken into consideration. You can use, again, examples of fictional people or real people to tell your story. You yourself can be a character in a piece that you write. You can talk about how you came to arrive at the conclusion that you're going for in your piece. You can talk about what motivated you to do your research. And I often tell, particularly scholars that I'm working with, to really think about why your idea matters to ordinary people and make sure that is conveyed in the narrative that you're presenting. Stories connect the dots for people in disparate pieces of information. They explore causes, they explore relationships between things. So it's a way of digesting material. And I completely agree with what Carola said about using quotations in pieces. Everything that you use to bolster or illustrate your idea needs to be digested by you as the writer. That's the work that you have to do. That's why we don't want to see block quotations kind of dumped into the middle of a piece. That material, your job as the author is to digest it for the audience. That's not their job. They're not supposed to be scratching their head trying to understand how this sort of foreign objects fits into the story that you're trying to tell. A story has a moral. It explains why something matters, both to you and to other people. And it also can reveal values. I mean, as an academic, you don't have to be afraid of conveying values to your audience. You know, maybe the value has something to do with fairness or accountability. You don't have to shy away from that. You can express those values in a piece. A good story is something that people can remember. It's something they want to pass along. That's what we as human beings do. We recount stories to each other. It's one of the building blocks of how we communicate. So if your piece tells a good story, it's going to be remembered better. And the last point I want to make is about connection, and that has to do with what the other speakers have also pointed out about knowing who your audience is. Is it policymakers? Is it the general public? Maybe you're writing to journalists. But you're having a conversation with your audience when you offer them a piece of writing. You need to convey empathy with that audience and, think about what information and perhaps biases, frames of reference they're bringing to the table when they sit down to read your piece. You're exchanging ideas with them. You're posing questions to them. You know, when you're writing for a general audience, you don't have to be as formal as you have to be in an academic piece. You can use humor. You can tell a joke. That's totally okay, depending on the venue. You know, it's sometimes more appropriate than others. But you can use play of imagination and intellectual play. And there's also a matter of tone when you're connecting to people. When I've taught opinion writing, I often find that people feel like they need to be very aggressive with their opinions, that's how you sound compelling, to use an aggressive tone. But I advise using a tone that's assertive. You know, it's something a little bit more empathetic to your audience than aggressive. And don't be afraid to question yourself. Don't be afraid to admit if there's some part of your idea that needs further work by other scholars. Perhaps you're going to do further work on it. You don't have to sound, like everything there is to know about whatever this idea is that you're sharing. And don't be afraid to acknowledge other points of view. I mean, that adds credibility, I think, to your piece. You can't really, you might not have time to do that in an 800-word piece that Claire was talking about, but in a longer piece, you can do that. I think it's really helpful, especially when you have written a shorter piece, to read it aloud. That often allows you to pick up things with your ear that you might not see on the page, that kind of don't sound quite right. It might help you catch grammatical errors in a way that you don't necessarily find when you're scanning something. And I definitely tell people, whenever you're turning a piece of writing in, to an editor or putting it up on a website, sleep on it. Read it with fresh eyes in the morning. I can't tell you the number of times I have edited a piece that I've written and thought it was absolutely perfect, and I sleep on it and I wake up the next morning and I think, oh my gosh, how in the world did I miss that? So those are my tips, and just one tip. I'll sort of add a fourth tip about writing for the web. Headlines are really important, and often editors will take a piece that you've written and tweak your headline or even write an entirely new one. But I can't tell you the number of times someone has submitted a piece to me as an editor that doesn't even have a title on it. And that title really crystallizes your idea. So that one sentence idea that you've written down, that you've thought about, is going to be really helpful in knowing what your headline should be. So I think it's really helpful to offer a very sharp and focused headline to an editor so they don't have to sit there and start from scratch, even if they end up using something else. And, headlines can, at times, they can ask a question. They can, offer a provocation or a challenge. Again, it's something that has tension in it, something that everybody on the planet doesn't already know, something that you're offering to the conversation that is fresh. So really, really think about writing good headlines, because when people view lists on social media, the headline really has to catch their attention and their interest. You, as a writer about economics for a general audience, you have the challenge of creating interest rather than assuming it. You could probably assume interest if you're writing for an academic journal, but you cannot do that with a general audience. And in fact, economics is the topic that you probably have to work the hardest at to create interest, because people are a little bit allergic to it, and they think, oh, it's just going to be something with a bunch of jargon that I'm not going to understand. What does it have to do with me? So that's part of the work that you have to do, is really to create the interest. So that's my spiel, and I hope that was helpful.
I think that was super helpful, Lynn. Thank you so much. I mean, for me, the point about values really stands out, especially because we are in a discipline that seems to think it's all about objectivity. And as we push back against that, it's helpful to remind oneself that it's okay to pull from that place of values. So we're not yet done. We still have Paul Dudenhefer's written input, which I think is going to be a really nice complement to what we've already heard. He has prepared some things for me to read out, which address in particular how to write for journals, academic journals. So I'm just pulling up a picture of him so that you can feel he's speaking to us. And then I will take just a few minutes to read it for you. So, many thanks to INET for allowing me to submit these comments in writing. I would have much preferred to give them to you either in person or via video conferencing, but I'm traveling today, so I'm unavailable. My comments will address two matters. The first concerns journals and how they work. The second concerns writing the kind of economics papers you find in Quarterly Journal of Economics, the American Economic Review, Econometrica, and the like. So first, journals and how they work. Time constraints force me to be really choosy here, so let me point out two things that you may not be able to find in other places. When you submit a paper to a journal, you should receive a confirmation that the paper has been received, usually within a day or two, and certainly within a couple of weeks. If 2 weeks go by, you've not received word that your paper's been received, you're perfectly within your rights to go email the journal and confirm that they have received the paper. I would email the managing editor about this. If there's no managing editor, then email the editor. The review process at a journal can take anywhere from a few days to a year or more. You should plan on it taking at least 6 months. If 6 months have passed and you haven't heard from the journal, you're perfectly within your rights to email the journal and confirm that your paper is under review. I would email the managing editor if the journal has one. Again, if there's no managing editor, email the editor. When it comes to submitting a paper to a journal, most papers are submitted prematurely, before they have been seriously vetted by your colleagues. Ask at least 2 colleagues to read and comment on your paper before you submit it. In addition, you should present your paper at 2 or 3 seminars or workshops and at 1 or 2 conferences for additional feedback. The vast majority of papers that are accepted for publication have first gone through a serious vetting process by your research community. That vetting process happens in private and at seminars, at workshops, and at conferences. So before you submit to a journal, make sure that you have put your paper through that process. dealing with referee reports. So, you submitted your paper and you've now been invited to revise the paper, taking into account the referee reports, and submit the paper again. If you're lucky, the editor will tell you which aspects of the referee reports you should take into account and which ones you can ignore. But that's only if you're lucky. In many cases, the editor will simply send you the reports with little or no guidance and leave it to you to make sense of them. If the reports don't contradict each other and don't ask you to add a lot of things to the paper, that might not be a problem. But if the reports do contradict each other, a not uncommon thing, or ask that you add lots of content to the paper, then you have a problem. If that's the case, you're perfectly within your rights to ask the editor for guidance. But keep in mind that you'll have to make this as easy as possible for him. For example, you will need to point out where the report contradicts each other and suggest how you might deal with the contradiction. Or if the reports ask you to do a lot of extra things, you might need to say that you see the wisdom of doing A, B, or C, but not of D, E, and F, and you would explain why. So these are the 3 takeaways. Expect the review process to take at least 6 months. Email the journal if you haven't heard from them after 6 months. And ask the editor for help with contradictory referee reports. Okay, now part 2, writing. My comments on writing are largely meant with empirical economics papers in mind. First of all, no one expects you to reinvent economics from the ground up. Think instead in terms of marginal but meaningful changes to existing scholarship. You can think of a paper as involving 3 major elements: the question the paper asks, the data the paper uses, and the model and methodology the paper uses. Most papers involve taking an existing paper and challenging 1 or more of those 3. I think my dog agrees. To put that another way, as with any other scholarly paper, an economics paper is situated in what's known as the literature. The literature refers to other scholarly papers on your topic. Most papers extend or modify or supplement what's already been done in the literature. In some respects, writing economics papers is easy, in that they usually contain a standard set of sections. Here, I will focus on the introduction, as that section tends to give writers the biggest problem. You can think of the introduction as a miniature version of your paper as a whole. That is, in the introduction, you will discuss to one degree or another your question, your data, your model, and your results, and how they all relate to and differ from the existing literature. How much space you devote to each one can differ depending on what's important about your paper. Speaking of what's important about your paper, 2 things that readers look for in your introduction are your motivation and contribution. The 2 could overlap. A few words about each are in order. I think motivation is the reason for your paper in the first place. What problem in the real world or in the literature does your paper address? And just how big or serious is the problem? Most introductions begin with the motivation. I think of contribution as what's new or different about your paper and why it matters. This is often something that only other economists can get excited about. So it involves the data or the model or the methodology or some combination thereof. One place you bring out your contribution is in the literature review. In the literature review, you want to be explicit about how your paper differs from others and why that difference matters. That last point is important. Novelty alone is rarely sufficient. A note to non-native English speakers. First of all, most of you write better English than you think. And the more you work in English, the better you will become. Second, there are many editorial services that will correct the English mistakes in your paper. You can always see if you can hire one of those if you're worried about your English. And third, I've never known a paper to be rejected solely because the English had lots of mistakes. It could be that referees failed to see what was valuable about your paper because you didn't communicate it well enough, and that may or may not have something to do with your written English. But no paper that I know of has ever been rejected solely because it contained a lot of grammatical mistakes. Let me close by recommending 2 books. So this actually answers some of the questions in the chat asking for resources. My goodness, 2 books. One is by Helen Sword and is titled Air and Light and Time and Space: How Successful Academics Write. Professor Sword's book discusses the 4 habits of an academic's writing life. Behavioral habits, which refer to things like writing routines. Artisanal habits, which treat writing as a skill that you will spend your entire life improving. Social habits, which pertain to the collaborative nature of writing. Think conferences and seminar presentations. And emotional habits, which involve cultivating certain mindsets that promote joy and creativity. The second book is by Joseph Williams and Joseph Bishop and is titled Style: Lessons in Clarity and Grace. I think it's now in a 12th edition. Style is the best book I know that will show you how to take something you've written and revise it so that the writing is as clear as can be. Thank you for your attention. Again, I wish I could have made these remarks in person. Paul Dudenhefer. So I see some of you have already put the links to the books that he mentioned in the chat. I definitely, I think I already bought one of them, but I'm definitely going to look into those. And I recommend also that you look at Paul Dudenhefer's website. It's just pauldudenhefer.net. Let me put that in the chat as well, because he has a lot of useful guides on writing and more, actually, when it comes to early career PhD life and such. So we have a wealth of information, that has sort of erupted here. And to be honest, I wish we would have had an hour for each of our panelists, but let me stop talking and see if we can bring some questions to the floor. So we've got, I see a few questions that were very specific to sentence level editing that Carola was already very kind to answer in the chat. I would actually also encourage the panelists to share books that come to mind, or websites or other resources that might be useful. And the chat is probably a good place to put those too as you think of them in the next few minutes, because then people can look them right up and put their bookmarks down. But let me, for a question to actually comment on, let me ask you all a little bit about your process, because I think that is maybe the most, oh my God, I'm sorry. Let me let the dog downstairs so he doesn't disrupt any further. Go on. This is the pandemic life. Okay, so I would love to ask you about your process, because I think that is the most mysterious bit of writing. Sometimes it seems like writing is as simple as using your fingers to type words, but there's so much behind it all, and you've already alluded to a lot of these things, right? Lynn said sleep on it, for example, which is a major one, or use long form handwriting was another from Claire. But maybe give us a little bit more about your personal process and what young scholars should realize about writing when it comes to that. I think Lynn has a hand up, so let's start there.
Yeah, it's interesting. You wouldn't think of writing as a physical process, but it really is. And after I've done an intense piece of writing, I can really feel it in my whole body. And so I think getting up to take breaks to walk around when you're doing an intense piece of writing is a really good thing to do. And the interesting thing is, at least for me, and I hear this from other writers, walking around time can often generate or clarify ideas in a way that for some reason doesn't happen sometimes when you're sitting down in front of your computer. Just the physical act of walking, I get what I call walking ideas sometimes others get it, when they're doing yoga or physical activity. So it's a weird thing, but I think writing is a physical process. And if you can, acknowledge that and work with it, it can be really helpful.
Wonderful. Claire, I would love to go to you. I think Jay in particular was curious to hear about your process and is actually also asking how your relationship is with editors. Do they read each article that you write? How does that work?
I've got some rather loud church bells in the background. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. So the process, really interesting question. I think I just want to post a link in the chat actually to a book that I would recommend on this called Daily Rituals, which kind of breaks down the kind of writing and creative rituals of all sorts of, talents really. And the kind of remarkable thing about it is just how diverse they are. That everyone has the routine, but everyone's routine is different. So I'd really recommend reading that because it's just a fascinating read to begin with. And I think it also shows that it is a personal thing. But I mean, let me tell you a bit about my routine. I think for quick pieces like news pieces, when you're under a lot of time pressure, I mean, you've just got to hammer them out. I mean, you kind of you learn to do that when you're beginning as a journalist, what to put in the first paragraph, what to put in the second paragraph, what to put in the third paragraph, and you just have to do that very quickly. When you have a bit more time, I think there's a couple of things I'd say. I mean, I'm definitely with Lynn that I'd kind of like write in the afternoon or evening and then ideally sleep on it and then get up and look at it again. For some reason, that makes it an awful lot better. Another thing that can help is once you've kind of got like your kind of final draft, print it off and read it from the kind of like from the bottom up. So kind of like read the last sentence first and then go up and up and up like that. And that's a really decent way to catch errors. Another thing that I like to do, which I think is probably relevant for the students as well, is just when you go through, just circle with red pen all the numerical figures. And then what I do is I always try to double check them because, the amount of times when you write, billion when you meant trillion, or, just stupid mistakes like that can really let a decent piece down. You really don't want to make them. So I think just kind of like circle your figures and check and then double check.
Super. Carola, would you be able to add something on how?
Yeah, I mean, I can add in more on writing academic pieces, writing pieces for journals. I mean, I agree that it's nice to have a routine if you can, but you also don't want to get too hung up on it. So, I mean, I used to think, okay, I can only write if I have a day set aside, hours set aside for writing. Now I work from home with 4 kids under 7, and I just write whenever I can, and I try to just crank it out even if conditions are not ideal. But the other thing, so one thing that's really helpful advice that I got from a professor one time was to try to write your introduction first, even before like running your regressions and so on. Before you have your results, can you at least write those paragraphs, motivating it and saying what your contribution is going to be that will hold up regardless of your results? And if you can do that, then it's worth going and doing the analysis. If you can't write that introduction first, then you probably haven't really thought through the paper enough yet. I think, if you can write the introduction and then sort of set up the other sections, you're going to have, here I'm going to have the data section, here I'm going to explain, just make your section headers so what you're kind of planning to have in the paper. Think about what your, kind of your first figure is going to look like. So you might have a bunch of appendix tables with all sorts of regressions and stuff, but is there one key figure that's going to kind of make your point? It might just be a time series graph. It might be a scatter plot. But you want to have like, your results should not hinge on some fancy econometric technique. They should hold up to that, but they should also kind of show up in a time series plot or in a scatter plot if they're really, if you want to have a really strong motivation for it. Other things, I mean, I usually write my papers in LaTeX, which allows you to have comments in there. So if I am like working with a co-author or just wanting to remind myself, I'll put a comment by a figure saying when I last updated it. So I know whether it's something I need to check, whether it's from an old draft or not. By the numbers to like a paragraph that has some numbers in it, I'll say CB updated November 20th. So that, you know, me and any co-authors know that I've checked those numbers recently. And yeah, I like to make it like a game of making it shorter. So I'll look at, oh, this paper is 45 pages long. Then I'll go through and just cut things, and keep looking like, oh, I got it down to 43. Oh, I got it down to 42. And, you know, knowing the starting point, and every time I see one page go away, it's like a little exciting little kind of mood boost there. Yeah, those are some of the big things. Also, just keeping like having some sort of bibliography management program that you use. I use JobRef to manage references in a bib file, and then you can kind of copy your bib file from one project to the next. So if I know I'm going to be citing a lot of the same papers as I did in a previous project, I can easily have a starting out bibliography file and save myself a lot of time that way. So those are some of the main ones as far as process.
Thank you. We have oh yeah, Lynn.
Yeah, just really quickly, I had a professor tell me, a writing professor tell me that when you think you've written something really wonderful, cut it in half, which is kind of a challenge. That's the big game challenge. That might be a little draconian, but that just, you know, puts it in mind that brevity is really important. And I saw a couple of questions about fear, and I just wanted to comment really quickly because boy, does that resonate with me. I've done academic writing as well as popular writing. And I remember one of the first times I submitted something to a journal, the reader wrote me back, "Your style is a disaster." It's just, you know, wow. So I started very early on in my career thinking of rejections or comments like that as badges of honor, because they meant that I put myself out there. You know, I've tried. And that is an accomplishment. That is a huge thing to recognize and appreciate yourself for when you have, even if you've submitted something and it gets a rejection, that is a milestone. It's a stepping stone, you know, that helps you get to the place of publication. So badge of honor.
Yeah, I keep a big spreadsheet for every paper that, you know, I've gotten a complete draft of. I put a line for it in an Excel sheet, and then I put the journal and the date that I've submitted it, right? And then the outcomes. And yeah, I mean, some papers, they'll go to like 8 journals and take a couple of years to get from that first point to getting published. And one of my favorite papers that I've written, I think, had the largest number of rejections. So, you know, yeah, so it gets easier to like stop worrying so much about it. And the other thing is like the more papers that you publish, the more you're going to be asked to be a referee. And that's part of your job as a writer too. It's not writing things like what a reviewer wrote to Lynn, right? Don't say, oh, your style is a disaster. You can be a good writer in your referee reports about getting your points across, but in a polite way. And it's more helpful to give people specific examples of where they, you know, how they could improve their style if their style is a problem, without just saying, oh, it's a disaster, and not being constructive about it.
The funny thing is that the reader who wrote that comment ended up editing a book that I wrote. So you know,
there you go.
And she thought she was making a constructive comment, but it turned out she really did like what I had written. She just, you know, had some stylistic issues. So there you go.
Those are some great words of encouragement. At the risk of bleeding into the break a tiny bit, I want to ask one last question, and I think it's a good one for Claire. It comes from Gonzalo Fonseca, who jumps off of your points of tailoring it to an audience, and he kind of shows the tension that has when it comes to inclusivity. So he says, how far to take, you know, this tailoring to avoid exclusion. For example, if you're assuming that all the readers are middle class, or they're all active on social media, or that they're all parents, wouldn't you be at risk of alienating others? And how do you balance that tension?
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I mean, I think, you know, as I say, you just have to take that time to really think, you know, what are the characteristics of your likely audience? I mean, on the points that you mentioned, you know, are all readers parents? I mean, say, to pick one, I mean, if I was writing for the FT, I definitely wouldn't assume that. If I was writing something for Mumsnet, then I would assume that, you know. So I think you just want to think as like, who is the publication going to appeal to? I think when it comes to the FT, I'd assume a certain level of kind of like intelligence about public policy and business that was maybe higher than a kind of like a regular kind of like day-to-day newspaper or a tabloid newspaper. I'd probably assume, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put it in terms of like middle class, but I think, you know, a lot of our readers are probably like quite well off and quite high net worth. In terms of activeness on social media, I mean, I'd be careful about that as well, really. I think, I mean, we've got like quite a lot of older readers, but you know, if you're kind of like, if you're writing something on, say, Substack or something that's just like solely online, then of course, yeah, I'd assume that people were active on social media. So, you know, you can never appeal to like everyone and cover any bases, but I think, you know, what I would say is definitely if you give it some thought, you're going to come to a conclusion that's more on the mark than if you just write for your own sort of like quite narrow kind of like inside baseball-y sort of audience.
Super. Thank you so much. I think, you know, even though I would love to keep going, we better stick to the time and close out. But thank you so much, both to our fantastic panel and to a great audience for this session. We're going to now move into a break. But later today at 1 p.m. Eastern, we have the final session of YSI's Early Career Days. It's called The Challenge of Publishing as a Young Scholar, a conversation with journal editors. And it features Alyssa Brownstein, Ursula Costantini, Carlo Di Politi, and Thomas Ferguson. And it's moderated by Nicolas Aguila. So I think it's another not to miss session, and I hope to see all of you there. Thank you all so much for being here today. And we wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Great to be